Britain's schools are failing thousands of our poorest children. The most disadvantaged start school well behind their peers, and as they get older, the gap gets wider. The poorer you are, the less likely you are, and by a long chalk, to leave school with 5 good GCSEs. And almost half of these children leave school with nothing more than a D grade to show for it. The school secretary, Ed Balls, has vowed, I quote, to raise his sights and make narrowing the poverty gap his priority. Fine words, but can it be done? That's tonight's big debate. Good evening and welcome to the programme. Here to discuss the poverty gap and how to close it are a formidable panel of policymakers and commentators on poverty and education, as well as a cast of academics, head teachers and parents who will serve as our expert witnesses to cast light on the issues and suggest solutions. Listening to them and having their say will be our audience, offering a range of perspectives on the problems and how to solve them. To begin with, to give us a working description of the poverty gap, our first expert witness is Donald Hirsch. Donald Hirsch is a social policy analyst. He's worked extensively for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Child Poverty Action Group. Donald, you can demonstrate, can you, a link between poverty and underachievement at school?
Yeah, so the figures are really very clear. For children who are very young, before they go to school, they're already about 9 months behind in terms of school readiness, and that gap grows during the course of primary education. It becomes about a year, and then early in secondary education, it's about 2 years behind in achievement. So by GCSE, they've got much poorer chances, people who've grown up on low incomes.
Can you identify 1, 2, 3 key elements by way of explanation?
Yes, well, of course, a lot of people point to the fact that early experiences in the home can be very important, and things like whether your parents read to you and the kinds of richness of what you experience before you go to school. And I think some people think, well, you know, by the time people get to school, the die is cast. But what the recent Joseph Rowntree Foundation research on this is showing is that those disadvantages and experiences continue during the course of schooling. And a couple of things. One is that within schools, how children experience education from a very early stage differs. Poorer children seem to have a more negative experience. They feel more coerced in education. They lack the confidence. And perhaps linked to that is that outside school, children from better off backgrounds are getting a much richer experience of working with adults in after-school activities, and that actually can mean that children gain confidence, which they then bring back into the classroom. They're confident about themselves as learners. So we need to look at all aspects of children's lives.
Very interesting. Polly Toynbee, columnist, social analyst, writing a book on inequality. Does that chime with you?
Absolutely. All of the evidence piles up that the more you spend on children before they're 5, the more effective it is. Thereafter, it gets harder and harder. But we spend the money in inverse relation to proportion to how useful it is. We spend most per capita on universities, by which time there's no, children are fine. Next on secondary, next on primary, and least on under 5s. We need to turn it the other way around if we really want to improve the life chances of children and make the big difference to our overall education results.
Chris Woodhead, one of the most understated and most uncontroversial heads of Ofsted.
Thank you, John.
What do you make of it?
I agree with Donald that children from disadvantaged homes are obviously at a disadvantage, and one can understand perfectly easily why. If you're a middle-class child and you've got a home with books and your parents take you to museums and art galleries, then you've got a tremendous advantage in life. Where I perhaps disagree, and I'm not quite sure whether you're implying this, Donald, or not, is that it is a bleakly deterministic picture, by which I mean that if you are from a disadvantaged home, you are going to lose out whatever. And I say I disagree with that because I know of inner-city schools serving the most disadvantaged communities in the land, which make a tremendous difference.
Are you saying that, Donald?
No, on the contrary, I'm saying that it's not deterministic, but that in reality there are the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has talked to children from different sorts of schools and find that in reality a lot of children are getting a more negative experience of schools. And as Polly says, this starts very early on.
But my point is, and I'm glad you're agreeing with this, that it doesn't have to be like this. Yeah. Schools can and are making a difference, whatever the degree, intensity of the disadvantage.
Yeah. Phil Collins, erstwhile from the Social Market Foundation, then working in Number 10 on education issues alongside for Tony Blair. What's your reading?
Well, I think Polly's right about the big question, that the pattern of spending is absolutely the wrong way round. I think that's the biggest single large thing you could do to put this right. But I think there's a very, very big problem for policy. We always concentrate on schools because that's the bit that government can get its hands on. Actually, one thing that comes out of Donald's analysis is that what goes on in the home is critically important. Now, as policymakers, it's so difficult to know what to do about that because of the intrusive nature of it. So we're stuck, actually, in a debate where
that sounds like a counsel of despair.
It's not quite a counsel of despair, because it's not that there's nothing you can do. I mean, Chris is right. Of course, there's a great deal you can do. However, it's only ever going to be incomplete because you're battling constantly against a tide which is rising. And people are going back to a home which is not encouraging that learning. Teachers are catching up.
So there we've heard in some detail about the nature of the poverty gap, but let's move on now to what we can do to tackle it at school with the help of our next expert witness, Sue Seifert. Sue Seifert is renowned as an inspirational head teacher from the Montem Primary School in Islington, which is in inner London. What, for you, Sue, is the single most effective measure to tackle the poverty gap?
I need more money and I need smaller classes. You know, we're talking about these children. We say that they are deprived, they come in disadvantaged, and they certainly do. And I'm educating children of 4 or 5 in a class of 30 with just one teacher and one adult, another adult.
What size classes do you think would make a real difference?
Let's go to the private system, shall we? Where they do have the advantage, and they see that in fact, we have small classes, 15 for that age group. Let's put our money where our mouths are. Polly's quite right. Let's actually do something about this. We need smaller classes, and that's not only for that age group.
So would you take money away from the top end, as Polly was half implying, from universities relatively, and pour it into the primary schools, or do you just want a much bigger pot overall?
I think we need a bigger pot overall. I don't want to take money away from other people, but I mean, we have to be realistic about this. If we are going to bridge this gap, this is people, you know, resources in terms of people are the most important thing to me. These children need adults, good adult role models, and I can't pay them. I can't afford to have them in school. OK. More teachers, smaller classes, more money. Yes, please.
Gordon Brown said that he aspires to deliver equal spending on secondary school pupils, certainly, between the private and the public sector. Do you believe that the government is going to do that?
Well, I'd like to know how. I mean, which you know, very often we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and I'm not sure how he's going to do it. And I'm afraid over the years I've come not to trust what politicians say on either side of the fence. Sue,
thank you. Phil, don't go. Phil Collins, she's right not to trust, isn't she? I mean, you hear Prime Ministers saying education, more and more money goes in. We have this now big promise from Gordon Brown. It would cost, his own commitment would cost something like 16 billion, more than 25% of the present education budget, on top of the education budget, to get that equity. It's a non-starter.
I don't know why I've become the politician.
You're not.
No, but
let's
turn on Graham Brady.
You've had an inside track, though.
Yeah. It's going to be very difficult to get there. I have reservations about it too. I think it might chase up the price of private education, actually. I think they'll just simply respond by increasing the spending in the private sector. So I'm not sure either that more and more money is necessarily the most important thing. I mean, let's take class sizes. If you improve class sizes down to 15 across the system, you won't do anything to change the gap in attainment between people. That would have to be then targeted on certain sectors of the population, which might be a good idea.
The best class size would be of 1.
Of course it would bring up the attainment, because
overall it would, of course, but the gap between the top and the bottom would not be altered simply by doing it across the board. You'd need to target it on certain people.
But do we need to have the gap between the top and the bottom altered? I mean, it's about bringing these individual children up so that they are able to learn.
Chris Woodhead, on the face of it, you would think it was a no-brainer. As in private schools, smaller classes, more teachers. Yeah, it means more money, but isn't it obvious?
Sue, I agree with her. The class size issue is very important with young children. All the inspection evidence shows that smaller class sizes with young children make a difference, less significant the older the child. I also agree that inner city children, disadvantaged children, do need more money, and the schools, the kind that you run, need more money. But, and it's a very big but, and I think the lesson of the last 10 years is very, very critical here. I don't think pouring more money in itself transforms life chances of children. It depends what you do with the money.
Of course, that's true. And of course, in any budget anywhere, spending, some of it's going to go astray, some of it's going to get wasted. But there is developing this idea that the government has wasted all its money. We spent the taxes and we've wasted the money. What's the amount of improvement in education has been phenomenal. There is no doubt the numbers of more children staying in school, the numbers of more children getting much more education than they ever did and staying on to colleges and universities. It has been money well spent on the whole.
Sue Seifert, for raising that. Thank you very much indeed. Our next expert witness is Anne Palmer. Anne Palmer is a head teacher in Canning Town in London. Her school was formerly in special measures, but was recently awarded an outstanding grade by Ofsted. What's your secret?
I think it's very complicated. I think it takes a lot of hard work. I disagree entirely that students from lower socioeconomic groups, if you tell my staff that those students are not going to achieve by the time they leave school, you'd have a riot on your hands.
So you're with Chris Woodhead on that?
I'm absolutely with that. I mean, it's about raising the aspirations not only of the child but also of the parents. And if the parents are not engaging, then you make them engage. And one of the things that I say very clearly is that parents can assist, and obviously the evidence shows that parental partnerships is the best way to go in education. But actually, if the parent is not working with you, then you work round them, because the child has to be central to what you're doing at all times.
And what's the message to the child? What does the child have to understand, or do you manage to persuade the child to understand that makes a difference to their levels of attainment?
I think it's about confidence in the child. It's about raising their self-esteem. All children like to be recognised for the positive things they do. And if that information can be passed to parents, all the better. So the information is, actually, you have your talents, you have all your skills, but it's about directing them in the right paths to make sure that they achieve to the best of their ability.
And you've managed to raise the attainment levels of your school against the background of, by Sue Seifert's analysis, class sizes that are much too big, not enough teachers, and the need for much more money. Are you saying that that may be useful, but that you can do it in any case?
You know, money, fine. But actually, we know, again, that there are schools that have a lot of money but still don't get good examination results. I think it's how you use the money, how you modify your curriculum, how you work with the children, and how you support the children. We do not just look particularly at this teaching and learning aspect. We will say, what other things does this child bring with them? And put in all the support mechanisms around that child to ensure that all those barriers to them working in the classroom and achieving in the classroom take place.
Any of the teachers, pupils, parents, governors in our audience who want to respond to that, both in relation to class sizes and money, or indeed aspirational values? Yes.
I agree with the headmistress over here, because as a mentor in my school, I find myself dealing with the emotions of that child, which the school curriculum really doesn't deal with. And I agree with the parents as well, need to be involved with the student or work around that, because if this parent ain't there, that child still has to learn. So we have to deal with that student's emotion and deal with what they're going through outside. I know it doesn't really, a lot of schools say leave it at the gate, but they can't leave it at the gate, what they go through, a lot of these students.
What you seem to be saying, Paul, is this is not rocket science, actually. No. Is it?
Not at all, not at all. It's, you know, if that child just needs to know that that child can achieve, that child is great, and that child is, you know, and understand what they're going, and make that student understand that you know what they're going through and that you're willing to help them. And I think that goes a long way.
Down here on the right with the glasses and the schools. Yes, you.
Yeah, I want to take issue with what you're saying, that it's a solution for all schools, that somehow if the teachers and the head teacher provide high aspirations, that's going to solve the whole problem, because I don't believe that it will. I think in most schools there are actually high aspirations, but there is a huge well of poverty in some schools, and no matter how much you urge children to raise their expectations and step out of their background, the background will hold back, and the statistics bear that out.
Anne,
and
reaction to that?
I think basically what you're saying is that we fight against the odds, but in some circumstances you actually don't get anywhere. You cannot possibly tell that to teachers that are working hard, that have the highest aspirations, that are working solidly with children in the inner cities. A child only gets one chance. That has to be central. They only get the one chance, and if you are not holding those aspirations for a child, where else have they got to go?
Of course we have the aspirations, but the crude reality is, and it's borne out by the statistics over decades, that whatever our aspirations as teachers, and I'm an inner city teacher myself and I've been for 13 years, however hard we work, we will still find that 30%, 40% of our children won't achieve at GCSEs. So it's dangerous to play this game of just saying it's about raising aspirations, because I think that's fundamentally dishonest. I want high aspirations, don't get me wrong, but there has to be something with the high aspirations. It could be funding with high aspirations. If the politicians' aspirations met the teachers' aspirations and your aspirations with real funding, then I think we'd have a solution.
Polly, coming on that, as between those two views.
Well, they're both right. I mean, you couldn't possibly be teaching, or let alone be a head teacher of an inner city school, without knowing perfectly well that you can get hold of children against the odds and change the trajectory of their life. Of course you can. With brilliant head teachers, brilliant schools, you can make a lot of difference. But nevertheless, the underlying reality is that you are running up a down escalator all the time. And some people can run faster up down escalators, and some people make it. It's not true that nobody makes it who is poor to succeeding and getting A-levels in university. It just means it's very, very much harder, and you have to recognise that.
Given where the world is at the moment, Phil Collins, from what you said earlier, I suspect that as it were, in the balance, you would be inclined to take Anne's view about this.
Yeah, I mean, what we're doing is we're finding the various components which are instrumental to make a good school. So nobody's entirely right, no one's entirely wrong. But yeah, so I'd endorse what Anne said. There's something in what she said which I think is critical, which is when she talks about having an education which was appropriate for each child. Now, that absolutely is critical. And I think generally throughout the system, we're not very good at that. And the question is begged as to why not? Why, if you've got some fantastic techniques in a school which has gone from the bottom to the top, why does that not spread?
Because it's absolutely dependent on the personality of the head teacher and the teachers in his or her school. You can't spread good practice. It's not like manure. It springs from the human beings who are involved.
The woman at the back there on the inside.
The resources that we mostly have in schools are the people. And so it works well when we've got high quality teachers and support staff who've got a really good career path ahead of themselves, so that they are easily recruited into inner city schools because they're good places to be. So it's not just a case of 1 to 15, it's one very high quality, well-trained teacher.
And do you have a view about why there aren't enough high quality teachers? Education, education, education has been the mantra for as long as quite a lot of people have been alive. Why are there not enough individual teachers with the kinds of qualities that Anne is espousing?
There are a lot of very high-quality teachers, but we've got to keep supporting them. It's no good just putting them in.
You're talking about money or what?
Well, I think with development, professional development, with opportunities to broaden their ideas, with opportunities to move in the sector, and with opportunities to help individual children. We work for children.
I imagine Chris would agree that the quality of teaching, it may not be high enough, has gone up a great deal. I mean, the numbers of people applying to be teachers has gone up by 70%. That means you're attracting people where even now, in a time of full employment, it's become one of the top 10 occupations people leaving university want to do. And back in '97, it used to be right down the list. But it's become much more desirable, so we must be getting much better people.
But a tragic number of young teachers leave the profession very soon after they've entered it. There's 3 reasons why we don't have enough good teachers in inner city schools. We've got some very good ones, but 3 reasons why we haven't got enough. 1, because of discipline. There are too many schools where the teachers spend their time just trying to stop the children misbehaving in the most violent way sometimes. Secondly, bureaucracy. This government, Blair government and the Brown government, have bombarded teachers with paperwork and bureaucracy, which has driven many good teachers out of the profession. And thirdly, we don't pay inner city teachers enough. We should pay them double, treble what they earn at the moment if they are making the difference that Anne and her colleagues in other schools are.
I see a number of smiling faces, particularly at the last point. I just want to give the last word on this to Anne.
To me, it's about sustainability. Now, if you have schools that are developing very rapidly, actually what it shouldn't have is leaders that move out just for the school to go back to where it was in the first place. So that building capacity over time, I think it's absolutely essential, and it's essential in any school that's going to be going to sustain high standards and high examination results.
And thanks very much. After the break, the question, have the middle classes come to dominate the state system? And if so, is it time for more fundamental reform? That's in a moment. Welcome back. There's a widespread view that the education system entrenches the advantages held by the most privileged rather than helping the poorest. So let's look now at how the structures of the system might be reformed to combat the poverty gap more effectively. First, those league tables. Our next expert witness is Professor Dylan Wiliam. Professor Wiliam is Deputy Director of the Institute for Education, and he advocates reform of the league tables of a pretty fundamental kind. You think they're not part of the solution, but part of the problem, don't you?
Absolutely. The real problem is that we've created incentives for schools to focus on particular kinds of students. It used to be the most able, now it's the students on what they call the bubble, the grade CD borderline. And so helping a student who might otherwise get an F to get an E is not recognised in any way. We've made some inroads towards that with contextual value added, but as long as we keep on publishing the raw results tables, then that's the one that gets the attention, and that's the one that actually people focus on.
But there have been a huge number of modifications to try and, as it were, meet the concerns that you have.
Yes, but the problem is that parents are being misled. What parents want to know, ideally, is how will my child do if they go to this school? Now, obviously, you can't predict that in the future, but the danger is that if you actually rely on raw results, what you're getting is information about how good the school is at attracting smart kids rather than how good it is at teaching.
Chris Woodhead.
No, I mean, I disagree. I tend to think that Ken Clarke was right when he was Secretary of State for Education, and he said that he preferred the data raw rather than cooked. Yeah. And I think the more sophisticated our analysis of the data, the less intelligible it becomes to parents. I think, point two, that parents are perfectly capable of comparing half a dozen local schools, all of which are serving similar community, similar children in those schools, and seeing that in one school the children are doing 2 or 3 times better than in the other school. So I think that the existing league tables do the job which league tables should do.
I think you're wrong. I mean, I think that the problem is that the existing league tables help you work out what's happening to those different kinds of students. What we need is an index of how much value the school is adding. How much do children actually learn at that school?
Aren't you, by advocating this, actually suppressing some pretty simple information
yes.
that a lot of parents, whether they are well off or not well off, might want to have?
Yes, but the point is that it's misleading, and therefore they'll make bad decisions. So I think it is, yes, they might want it, but I think it's bad data, and it's unhelpful to have it in the public domain.
Even if it does involve suppressing the information, parents, voters in a free society say, we want this information. You would say, sorry, in the interests of all children, and we think in your interests, you can't have it.
In the same way that we suppress the data that Ofsted has on individual teachers.
Which we shouldn't do either.
OK, but at the moment we actually say that it's OK to suppress the data that Ofsted has on the quality of lessons delivered by individual teachers because it's deemed to be an unhelpful use of that data. I have no problem with that.
Polly? Where are you
wildly unrealistic politics. I mean, I think this is a bit of very obscure academic educational establishment thinking, to think that you could not tell people how many children in a school have passed the exam or not. People need to know that. They need that raw data. I absolutely agree that they also need the other information, but not suppressing the exam results. I agree that those exam results will largely reflect the nature of the children who've gone there. And if you compare the numbers of children with free school meals and their exam results, they're usually in inverse proportion to one another. This is all information that you can get when you look up about a school. And I do think you do need a lot more of that softer information about value added, though, because it's true that you do need to know how good they're being for the children who aren't necessarily performing very well but need
But if you have the raw data, are you advantaging the middle-class families who are better, perhaps, or disproportionately good at analysing that raw data?
Yes, but that's not the way to go about it. I mean, you can't say we're going to keep everybody in the dark. I mean, it just isn't practical, it isn't sensible, nobody will put up with it, and nor should they.
Phil Collins.
The way to get schools to focus on the progression of students is to pay them according to how much progress they made. If we had payment by results for schools, then you'd really have a sharp incentive for them to do it. That would be far more important than league tables. The league tables are a necessary and important source of information for parents. We should be supplementing them but not suppressing them. But pay them according to what they do.
That's a brilliant idea.
I bring in our audience here. The woman second in the second row.
I mean, what you're assuming is that all parents are going to be wanting to make these choices, and what we need for all children really is to know that local schools are going to be good, that their local school is going to be good. And what, you know, the whole thing about league tables is the effect that it has on schools which aren't doing so well, and the children that are left in those schools. So, you know, it's all very well for those parents who are making, or the children of those parents who are making those choices, but what about all those children whose parents don't make a choice?
So what conclusion do you draw from that about league tables, that they should be...
I teach in Wales, and there are no league tables in Wales, so I would...
And there's no disbenefit in Wales from their absence?
No, you know, that's...
Chris Woodhead, on that. They do perfectly well without them?
Well, I think that most parents do want to exercise a choice. I'm sure your school, Anne, is oversubscribed because your local community knows it's a good school. Good schools are popular schools because parents, whatever their social class, want their children to attend those schools. I think it's patronising to assume otherwise.
We all, of course, know that places at the best-performing schools are hugely, generally, oversubscribed, and that getting your child in often depends on whether you can afford the inflated house prices in the surrounding area. So what, if anything, should be done about that? Our next expert witness is Sean Pilo de Shinnessy. Sean's a parent from Brighton who played a prominent part in the successful campaign to introduce admissions ballots in the city. What were they designed to achieve, Sean?
Designed to achieve equality and fairness. I think one of the key issues really we see nowadays that holds a lot of children back, certainly in terms of fairness, is this whole issue of the so-called golden halos. It's a fact that we recognised by parents and teachers throughout the country, that the age-old issue of when parents can afford it and when they are able to do so, that they will move and cluster around the better schools.
Well, aren't there a great many parents, maybe middle-class parents, who say, we didn't squander our money on long holidays or gambling. We put our money into getting into a house which allowed us to get into a school in the state system which we are supporting, and you are turning this into a lottery for us.
That's how it was portrayed, if you like, by the anti-camp, who were sort of portraying the entire thing as being the workings of a sort of a crazed, sort of, you know, liberal or sort of left-wing mind. And what we were sort of at pains to point out was that all we were doing was bringing in equal access. So by basically bringing in, you know, equal preference via fixed catchments with a tiebreaker ballot or a lottery or a random allocation, however one chooses to actually look at it. All we were doing was saying on a postcode basis, and everyone knows which postcode they live in, every child in those areas would be treated equally. And so basically all that would do, we would just do away with the golden halo thing and bring in equality. It wasn't disadvantaging anyone. And so, for instance, I mean, one of the very welcome, one of the sort of like integral benefits of this was that in Brighton, children in eastern Brighton, in our poorer areas, the sort of deprived children, they'll now double their access to the better schools.
We'll pause there and bring in Phil Collins. The former Prime Minister, who I think most people remember was Tony Blair, although he's been written out of quite a lot of scripts, could have introduced this as a policy, but he sort of shied away from it. Why?
He did. The reason he shied away from it is precisely the reason why I'm in favour of it, which is that it, of course, strips the middle class of a perk. It strips people like me of the opportunity to buy a house, more expensive house.
Did you say that to him, incidentally?
Many times.
What did he say back to you?
He said...
C'est la vie in English.
He said he thought it was unfair.
Right.
My own view is it's the only fair way to organise schools when they're oversubscribed. Everyone has a choice first, but then let's say 100 people have chosen a school which only has 40 places. You then have to have some mechanism for adjudicating who gets in. Now, you can do it by proximity, if you like, as we do now, which simply means that the house prices around that school go up, or you can do it fairly by a ballot. You don't start with a lottery. You exercise a choice, and then if there's an oversubscription, you sort them out by ballot.
Is there a partial solution to the choice issue within that context of saying, well, more schools? Anyone who wants to start a school, they should do it.
Absolutely. One of the other ways of having more effective choice is you've got to have a greater supply of schools. I mean, you look at New York...
Let every flower bloom and some will wither on the stem?
Not entirely unregulated. I mean, there are certain things that have to happen in schools. And I mean, I think payment by results would be a very, very effective form of regulation, actually. But if you look at some jurisdictions like New York, where hundreds of schools have sprung up in the last few years, because they allowed people, subject to meeting quite stringent regulatory requirements, to set up new schools. And what they do is they bring new people in and they force up the standards of those who are already there.
Basically, I agree with you, 1,000 flowers bloom. That must be the right way. The thing that worries me about the Brighton and Hove is that it seems to me a counsel of despair. Supply is never going to meet demand, is the implication. And what should be done, of course, in that authority is more good schools. And we've got to think of ways of bringing more suppliers into the market.
Are they? I mean,
more suppliers into the market
at all.
Sorry?
They're not incompatible. I mean, I'm in favour of more good school places, but where there are
yes, there are always going to be popular schools. Because even if you have lots of good schools, you're still going to have one that's probably more popular than the others. I mean, one hopes the standards go on and on going up, but there'll always be a bit of a ranking because that's human life. What seems to me that people are missing out here is that in the end, particularly in a place like Brighton and Hove, the middle classes win out because what happens through a lottery system is that the middle class children then get spread about amongst the schools. That raises the standards quite often in those schools.
Does it? It's a real
yes,
question,
it does.
Polly.
I think very often people are worried about sending a middle class child, to a school where perhaps they think there's nobody else who lives in a posh house or has our sort of background. This child's going to feel stranded. And if suddenly you have a core of children, so you have a good mix, and you know that from whatever strata of life you come from, you're not going to stick out like a sore thumb. I think that makes a lot of parents feel better.
We talked about choice. Tony Blair, again, used to talk about choice and the case for choice. It doesn't seem to register on the new Prime Minister's agenda, does it?
I'm not sure that's true. I don't think he's stripped anything back. I think, actually, what he's...
He doesn't sound like an enthusiast, does he?
I think what he's saying, and I think there's a good case for this, is that the rhetoric previously rather inflated the idea. Because I think that there was certainly a sense that choice was the answer, which obviously isn't true. All of the things we've heard here are part of the answer. It is also part of the answer. But I think we allowed the idea to germinate that we thought if only you had parental choice, then everything would be OK.
So he's not in that familiar phrase, a roadblock to reform in relation to this?
No, I don't think so. I think that actually...
You're not trying to ride two horses at once?
No, I think he's trying to populate the debate with other things as well.
I must bring in our audience now. Yes, right in the middle again, at the back.
My experience has been that the choice has been the other way round, that the schools have made the choices of the pupils by setting the caption areas, and they have chosen the areas to exclude certain areas, such as poorer areas, such as the area I live in, and they've used that as a way of doing it. So actually, parents don't have choice because it's the schools using their being able to choose where the places they take children from.
So in your own... you've got children, obviously.
Yes.
What have you done yourself?
We had a choice of 3 schools to make, but I only had one school, one choice, because the areas that were drawn excluded our area. So we had 2 schools that were within distance, but only one of them we could go to. That was the failing school.
So what did you do about that?
What did I do? I applied to the Roman Catholic school and pulled every string I could find, and I got on the television programme to do it, and that was a really good lever. But that's because I'm articulate, and I was angry, and I wanted to make a point. But most parents can't do that, and not everyone can do that.
And faith schools are the daftness in the system. A third of our schools are faith schools. We are the most atheistic country there is in the world. You've got to get down on your knees to get your children to
a decent
school.
school.
Kind of system
Absolutely,
is that?
and it really annoys me. Yeah.
Because you aren't a Roman Catholic either.
No.
It's all right to say that now, isn't it? Thank you very much. Academic selection and the grammar school system are often seen as the enemies of social mobility, keeping the gap wider rather than narrowing it. But those in favour of selection believe that the opposite is true. Our next expert witness is Graham Brady, the MP who earlier this year resigned from David Cameron's front bench over this issue. Graham Brady is a grammar school boy himself and the MP for Altrincham and Sale, an area which has an entirely selective system. So you want to go back and divide sheep from goats at the age of 11?
Well, I wouldn't want to impose a new system on anybody. What I'd say, first of all, is there is evidence that the selective system works very well where it exists. I think that if people want more selective schools, they should be allowed to have them. I don't think the state should be in the business of standing in their way. And I think the evidence now, in the modern selective system where it's practiced, I think the evidence is that the high schools, what used to be called secondary moderns, get very good results as well as the grammar schools. And that's absolutely critical in this. It's not just about grammar schools, it's about an academically selective system.
And your
working.
proposition is that the household which, say, doesn't have books, which has parents that aren't interested in education or not ostensibly interested in education, will thrive and prosper just as well within the selective system as without it?
Well, in an area like mine, where the grammar schools and the high schools are both very good, then you can say the child is likely to do well regardless of which school he goes to. But beyond that, I think we need to make the tests for selection as fair as they can be, and I think we certainly should do that.
Polly Toynbee.
I failed the 11 plus. I find it quite difficult still to admit that, because what it puts on you is a mark that says you must be quite dim, really. And the idea that it somehow, as you're suggesting, gets deep down below the child's actual ability to its real essence of its actual intelligence, it was the most damning thing you could do. And there were families split apart about why one child got in and the other one didn't. This happened to my partner's family. And it lasts for the rest of their lives. It is the most wicked and cruel system that could be devised, as well as being entirely educationally nonsensical, because
wicked,
the academic results in those areas
wicked,
tend
cruel,
to be much
not to
worse.
say nonsensical.
First of all, academically it works, and we can demonstrate that from the results. They get better results in selective areas than they do in comprehensive ones. But
That's
I think Polly's
Buckinghamshire,
point also illustrates one of the big problems in this debate, is that most people who debate it are actually rather out of date. And I don't mean that in an offensive way, Polly. The point is many people are looking at the selective system as it operated in the 60s, in the 70s, at a time when very often the secondary modern schools were under-resourced and were not as good as they should be. By and large, in areas like mine where we kept the system, what we've done is invest in the high schools, raise the standard of them, and it's worked extremely well.
Donald Hirsch, can I bring you in on this in terms of the poverty gap? Do we have any objective evidence which can clear the air between these two positions?
Well, first of all, I think it is quite difficult to say that the selective systems do better when we haven't got the same sorts of areas. I mean, I'm sure Buckinghamshire does do better than Hackney, but it's not a very fair comparison. Internationally, there is actually some quite clear evidence, and it does show that particularly where children are divided at a very early age, 10 or 11, as opposed to maybe 13 or 14, that does actually affect the gap we're talking about, the poverty gap. Adversely, it makes it wider. It makes it less. It makes the gap between the haves and have-nots have been wider in those systems.
You're walking a tightrope to opt for grammar schools in this case, if that's the case.
Well, I disagree. Well, no. I mean, if you read Frank Musgrove's School and Social Equality, his analysis of the pupil composition of grammar schools in the 40s and 50s and 60s in Britain and the destinations of the young men and women who went to those grammar schools shows that the United Kingdom was a far more socially mobile country then than it is now. And there is, I mean, we have seen...
We're talking about something different. I'm talking about what happened to the whole population, not to those who get to the grammar school.
Well, then you bring in, of course, the argument that Graham has been making. Namely, it isn't a matter simply of developing the best possible academic schools, but it's a matter of recognising that human beings differ profoundly in terms of their talents and their aspirations, and that some children will have practical vocational talents, and we should develop the best possible high schools to cater for those children. It's not an either or.
You can cater for different talents within one school, can't you?
Well, can you? Yes. Can you?
By setting and streaming?
The problem with the inner city comprehensive school isn't that the comprehensive principle is wrong per se, it's that you do not have enough bright children, often, in the inner city comprehensive to ensure that there is real peer group pressure, competition, drive to succeed. That's what the grammar school has got.
Up on the woman on the edge, on the back row on the right here.
Earlier on in this discussion, we were talking about the poverty gap, the attainment gap being correlated or not with the poverty gap. And I think we heard evidence that the attainment gap has actually increased in the last 20 or 30 years in this country. The important question in all of this debate is, what is it that enables every child to succeed to the best of their ability in an educational system? And there are many examples, and we heard from Anne earlier, examples of children who come from poor backgrounds. And I can think of an example myself of a family who are asylum seekers in the UK. The mother of the family is actually dead. The father doesn't speak any English. They're living in extremely poor circumstances. And their two daughters, they're from Iran, their two daughters are achieving in the best in their primary school at the moment. And if they had the opportunity to go to a selective grammar school, they would probably get into that school. I'm not a Conservative. I've never voted Conservative in my life, and I don't like to hear myself saying this, but it may be that extending the pockets of excellence in society, which are the grammar schools, in fact, could increase the attainment of people from very poor backgrounds.
Down
and
here
that's an important point.
in the second row.
Chris Wood had just said there isn't enough bright children in the inner cities. I don't know, I actually take exception to that.
I didn't say that. I said that within the comprehensive school, unlike the grammar school, you don't have a sufficient concentration of bright children. In the grammar school...
In the inner cities?
Yeah, particularly in the inner cities.
What about taking those children from Altrincham in a grammar school and putting them in the inner cities, and let's actually see whether that is actually the real issue.
In the back row there, yes?
Yes, I'm a parent from Lincolnshire, in the Shire town, Boston. We have grammar school, we have secondary modern schools. Every child in that town, from a socio-economic background, high or low, has the opportunity, with their parents, of the choice of sitting the 11 plus. It's voluntary. And secondly, every child in that town has the opportunity, if they're bright enough and able enough, to go to the grammar school.
OK, down here at the front, woman in the second in the front row.
The route to grammar school is where there are difficulties. I think my experience in Buckinghamshire over many years was that there was a huge investment by parents that could afford to prepare their children for the selection process. And wealth obviously plays a factor in that. If you can't afford the private tuition, you can't get to... You have less of a chance.
I want to come back to you, Graham Brady. You had to kick yourself out of the shadow front bench for holding the views that you hold. My question is, you now have both political parties, neither political party, wishing to change the existing ways in which grammar schools operate. Do you regard that as a failure and a betrayal on part of your own party leadership?
Well, I think the policy is wrong. I've made that very clear, and that's why I left the front bench, so I can make the case. And I will continue to make that case, and I am an optimist. I hope that policy will change.
I was going to say, you don't think it's now clearly a lost cause?
No, of course not. I think the evidence now is compelling that selective education works better than comprehensive education. And in the face of that evidence, to rule out a type of education that's working so well is simply wrong.
Can we ask our primary school head teacher, how she would feel if you were in a position where you had to cram your children up and see how many of them you could get past this gate and the other ones be sent to secondary moderns? How would you feel about that?
If I had to cram children for this kind of thing, I'd actually retire a lot earlier than I'm going to, because actually education is not just about the 3 R's. You know, and the poverty gap with these children, for them to actually grow and develop and like learning and want to go on learning, is not about cramming them.
Sue, you've actually probably taken us, at least in part, into what we're about to discuss after the break, with evidence that the worst performing group in our schools are white working-class boys. Are the middle-class multicultural values of the education system, as it's described by many, part of the problem? That's in a moment. Welcome back. almost half of those who leave our schools with nothing more than a D grade are white, working-class boys. Unless the education system can find a way to engage with these children, the poverty gap, of course, is here to stay. Our next expert witness is Phil Beadle. Phil Beadle is a former Teacher of the Year and the presenter of Channel 4's The Unteachables. Phil, how do you explain this if it's the case?
I'd like to refer quickly to something before the break, in that you said that multiculturalism is kind of antithetical to white working class attainment.
I was asking whether it was.
Right, well, for me, white working class attainment and the raising up of it is an intrinsic part of a proper functioning multicultural education system. I think the reasons behind it are myriad, and I'm not emphatic. I've been working quite hard in this, but I have no solutions. I have only questions. I think that given that Chris, I think almost 17 years ago, flagged this up as potentially the biggest disaster in our education system, and that now he's been borne out. The departing head of Deptford Green said that the kids with a real identity problem in our school culture are white working class boys specifically and white working class girls. Given that now the figures show that white working class boys are the lowest attaining, and they're also one of the biggest socioeconomic groups, how has this happened, and what do we do about it?
Do the how. You've got no definitive answer. Do you have a feeling of how they feel or what their identity problem is?
Well, I can give you anecdotal stuff. That you're talking about a class and a culture that is basically dying out and feel utterly under threat and feel completely marginalised by the education system. You have a situation where the lack of parental involvement with white working class parents is really quite striking. You've got a collapse of the family support unit, family mechanisms. The construction of adult masculinity is based entirely on physical stuff. Now, there's a lot of stuff that applies equally to black cultures, but my contention is, I think, that we need now, given that in inner city schools in London, white working class are now an ethnic minority, we need to actually start paying explicit respect to their culture and their traditions in the same way that the curriculum does, and has done quite successfully in some cases, for Caribbean West Indian kids.
And do you think that there is a distinct, identifiable white working class culture that differentiates it from other socioeconomic classes?
Yeah, it's the only culture that is actually not perceived as a culture whatsoever. Every single other culture is perceived as a culture, and yet white working class don't have one, which it does seep through our schools. Like they're applied. We still apply a kind of corporate guilt for colonialism quite often in schools.
So one more thing before I bring in the panellists. If you were saying, to use that word, if you were to give that culture more respect in the school, that you believe would at least assist the process of reaching, closing the poverty gap?
I think that as a solution is entirely tokenistic. I think it's for people much more intelligent and learned to engage with than me to actually start focusing on this as perhaps the biggest tragedy in the British education system at the moment, and start putting specific targeted input and specific, very high-order serious debate about it.
Chris Woodhead, what do you make of this?
I agree with much of Phil's analysis. I disagree with the solution. I don't think that to try to create in the curriculum a white working class culture that is relevant, that has appeal to white working class boys, would do anything than lock them in their existing preconceptions. I think the duty of all teachers is to try to introduce children of all ethnic cultural backgrounds to a common culture. That is the challenge, and that's what education is. The single thing that I think would help is to teach white working class boys to read.
Let me bring in the audience on this. Yes.
I think part of the problem is that the cultures are shifting so significantly. I'm from Stoke-on-Trent. The potteries, the ceramic industry has minimalised enormously over the last few years.
Are you a teacher?
No, I'm actually the director of a city learning centre. And one of the things that we've tried to do is to have some influence on young people across the cultures, including white working class boys, in terms of trying to re-engage them and their families, because it's a family trait where father, encourages the children to follow them into the industries that have now disappeared or have ceased to exist in the forms that they used to. So it's about going back to raising aspirations and broadening horizons.
Polly Toynbee.
Well, it seems to me that the real problem is that government after government has failed to do anything about the 14s to 19s who are not really going to get their GCSEs. If school has failed them and has failed their parents and they feel bad about school, you've got to get them out of school before they simply refuse to turn up anymore. And that's the great thing to do. But it's really hard for politicians because there aren't it isn't the talking point and you can't make it fly in elections.
The woman second in the back row.
I think there's two things sort of with that. One is, as a head teacher of a primary school, it irritates me how when it comes to target setting and tracking pupils, I'm required to produce separate data on ethnic minority children and never on sort of the white children within the school. And I must admit, anybody that comes to talk about target setting, I make them sit through discussing every child, because every child has a right to have their needs met in whatever way. And picking up on sort of what Polly said, it's about providing perhaps opportunities for them within our schools that they may not otherwise experience. We have a great project with our local university where the children go and experience at a very young age what being at a university might like, trying out a variety of courses. It may mean that that's never the route they take, but they've had their eyes opened to what may be available to them.
Phil Collins.
Let me try some suggestions of what you might do. It is outrageous that so many people leave school unable to read properly. It's just scandalous. If we don't fix that, then the rest of it is for the birds. That is absolutely the entry point to everything. You should not progress through school if you can't read to an adequate standard, and you stay there till you can. Second suggestion.
You stay in at what point you reach indefinitely.
You do two things. You have an immense amount of remedial help immediately, personal to that person, but the child... We know that if you don't hit the threshold at Key Stage 1, your chances of doing so at 2 are very small, at 3 they're smaller again, at 4 they're vanishing point. And yet we let people go through schools as though that were not true. And we know 23,000 of them will end up with nothing. We should stop this. They should progress when they're ready to progress. Second thought, if that were linked to the fact that the school only got paid when a child made progress, you'd see change. There's no question about it. You would see change. Thirdly, one of the big problems with white working class boys, and formerly I was one, is that their parents often, not true in my case, very importantly, do not engage sufficiently. Now, if that's serially the case, why don't we have champions for them? Why don't we have brokers for them? Why don't we go in loco parentis, have people to go there and be their champion and get things for them?
In the school? In the school?
Well, to go to the parents' evening, to go and ensure that their voice is heard throughout the school system, to do what parents do for children.
Yeah, all sensible. And Polly's suggestion I 100% agree with, that we have neglected the 14 to 19 curriculum for those who are not academic, and that is the crying tragedy. I don't blame the 14, 15-year-old white working class boy who can't read properly, who's humiliated every time that the teacher asks them to read, every lesson that they go to. I'd play truant, I'd misbehave. So yes. But I think we've also, coming back to this reading thing, we do know how to teach children to read. It's just that there's continuing resistance in some elements of the teaching profession to tried and tested methods.
Last thought, Polly Toynbee.
Well, I don't think that's the answer, but I do think we may now have the solution at last with Every Child a Reader. If we really can catch every child after the first year of primary school and pick them up and give them intensive one-to-one, it shows that for 38 weeks of half an hour a day, you fix it and it stays fixed. By the time they're measured again at 10, they are ahead of their group for children who've really fallen behind. We can do it. It costs money. Don't say we can do these things without money. You've got to spend it wisely, but it costs money and lots of good teachers.
And to you, Phil Beadle, final word.
I think the idea of teaching kids to read, as a secondary English teacher, I'd really like all the kids that I teach to be able to read.
It's quite important.
On that note, we have to stop because that's all we've got time for. Thank you to our panel here, our expert witnesses and our studio audience. And thank you, too, for watching. Good night.